Imagine the love of your life packing her bags and telling you that she's going on a romantic trip, with her boss. No arguments, no tears, just a cold, calm betrayal. What if she tells you that this has been going on for months and there's nothing you can do about it? At that moment, my world collapsed, and what happens next will make you wonder how far a person who has lost everything can go. The ticking of the clock echoed through the room, each beat drilling into Mason's mind like a relentless reminder of what was coming. He leaned against the door frame, his gaze locked on Emily, who was calmly packing her suitcase on the bed. Watching her fold the clothes, the same clothes she used to wear for him, made his stomach twist in knots. Emily was humming under her breath, something light and cheerful, as if this was just another normal evening. But tonight was anything but normal. "What are you doing?" Mason finally asked, breaking the uneasy silence with a voice strained by the weight of the moment. Emily didn't even bother looking up. "Packing," she replied flatly, her tone as casual as if she were talking about the weather. "Packing for what?" Mason's voice tightened, his body stiff as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. Emily paused, as if debating how much to reveal. "A trip for two," she said, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. "With my boss. And there's nothing you can do about it." Mason's heart skipped a beat. "A trip for two? You've got to be kidding me, right?" Emily sighed and finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of irritation and impatience. "No, Mason, I'm not kidding. We're going to a resort. It's a chance for me to get in good with him." Mason's mind raced, trying to comprehend the full meaning behind her words. "Get in good with him? And how exactly do you plan on doing that, Emily?" She shot him a sharp look, one that seemed to suggest he should already know. "By showing off my flexibility, in bed," she said with biting sarcasm. "He promised me a promotion if I play my cards right." Mason felt the breath leave his body. He stumbled back a little, gripping the door frame for balance. "What the hell are you saying? You're sleeping with your boss?" Emily shrugged, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "It's been going on for a while now, Mason. And guess what? He's better than you in every way." The words hit Mason like a gut punch. He had sensed something was off, the late nights, the secretive texts, but hearing it thrown at him like this was almost too much to handle. His fists clenched at his sides. "Emily, if you walk out that door tonight, I swear I'll make sure you can't walk again. Our marriage will be finished." Emily let out a laugh, cold and empty, sending a shiver down Mason's spine. "You know what, Mason? Our marriage ended months ago. When I started messing around with my boss, I realized you weren't enough for me. You're just too blind to see it." Mason's vision blurred with anger. He barely recognized the woman standing in front of him. This wasn't the Emily he had fallen in love with, the Emily he had promised to spend his life with. This woman was someone else entirely. "Why, Emily? Why would you do this?" His voice cracked, torn between rage and desperation. Emily rolled her eyes and tossed a pair of heels into her suitcase. "Why not, Mason? I'm tired of this life. Tired of you. My boss gives me something you never could, excitement, adventure, a future. You're just, dull." Mason's mind scrambled, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. "We can fix this, Emily. We can go to therapy, work on our marriage. Don't throw it all away for some cheap thrill." Emily's eyes narrowed with irritation. "A cheap thrill? You think this is just about sex? It's about so much more. My future, my career, my happiness. And you're not part of that anymore." Mason's heart pounded in his chest. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You don't have to do this, Emily. There's another way." Emily shook her head, zipping up her suitcase with a finality that made Mason's stomach turn. "I'm done with this life, Mason, and I'm done with you." She brushed past him, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air as she walked out of the bedroom. Mason stood there, frozen in place, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. This couldn't be real. Not like this. Not after everything they had shared together. But when he heard the front door open and shut, it hit him with a harsh clarity. Emily was gone. And she wasn't coming back. For a brief moment, Mason felt completely lost, like the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. But then, something inside him shifted. The shock and pain that had gripped him were quickly replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. He walked into the living room, eyes fixed on the door she had just walked out of. His breathing steadied, and a hardened determination began to settle within him. "If that's how you want it," he muttered under his breath, "then that's exactly what you'll get." The ticking of the clock seemed louder now, reminding him that time was moving on whether he was ready or not. His mind cleared, and he knew what needed to be done. She thought she could just walk out, toss their life aside like it meant nothing. But she was mistaken. She had made her choice, and now it was time for him to make his. He would prove to her that actions had consequences, and she'd regret ever underestimating him. Mason waited until he saw Emily's car disappear around the corner before he moved. His body was tense, but his thoughts were razor-sharp. He knew he needed to act swiftly and precisely. He had always been the calm, reasonable one, but tonight was different. Tonight, he would take control. He headed straight for the home office, closing the door behind him. The room was filled with tokens of their life together, pictures, framed achievements, books they'd picked out together, but Mason didn't focus on those. His attention was fixed on the desk where Emily's work laptop sat. He knew she trusted him enough to leave it there, never once considering that he'd have any reason to touch it. He sat down and opened the laptop. The login screen flashed in front of him, but Mason didn't hesitate. He typed in the password, a simple mix of their wedding date and her favorite color. The screen unlocked, revealing a cluttered desktop full of files and open documents. His hand hovered over the mouse for a moment before he clicked on the email icon. Her inbox popped open, filled with the usual work-related emails, but Mason knew exactly where to look. He searched for her boss's name, and a list of emails came up, a stark reminder of her betrayal. He opened the first one, his eyes scanning it quickly. "Looking forward to this weekend. Booked the best suite. We'll finally get some time to ourselves. Don't worry about work, I've got it all handled." Mason's jaw tightened, anger building beneath the surface. He copied the emails, dragging them into a new folder labeled Personal on her desktop. Then he plugged a USB drive into the laptop and began transferring everything. He made sure to get the attachments, the conversations, every single piece of evidence. He wasn't just going to confront her, he was going to dismantle the life she was trying to build on her lies. Once the transfer was done, he turned his attention to her work chat logs. These were more casual, filled with inside jokes, late-night flirtations, and even more explicit messages. He copied those too, adding them to the USB drive. When he finished, he carefully erased all traces of his snooping, leaving everything else just as it was. He leaned back in the chair for a moment, staring at the screen. There was no satisfaction, not yet. Only a cold, determined focus. The laptop was just the starting point. Mason stood up and left the office, heading toward the bedroom. Emily's vanity was cluttered with makeup, jewelry, and bottles of perfume. He opened the top drawer, finding her jewelry box stuffed with pieces he had gifted her over the years, along with some newer, more expensive items he hadn't seen before. One bracelet, in particular, caught his eye. It was the one she had bragged about, a gift from her boss. The thought of her wearing it while being with someone else made his blood simmer. He pulled out the bracelet along with a few other valuable pieces, stuffing them into his pocket. These would be the first things to disappear. She had adored these, flaunted them, showed them off. She wouldn't realize they were missing until it was far too late, and by then, it wouldn't matter. Next, He made his way to the closet, where Emily's clothes were neatly arranged in rows. He reached for the suitcase on the top shelf, the same one she had used for her business trips. Opening it up, he started yanking down her designer dresses and shoes, stuffing them into the suitcase, crumpling and creasing them on purpose. She had spent a fortune on these, thinking they made her look powerful, desirable, but they were just things, easily taken away. With the suitcase packed, Mason zipped it up and shoved it under the bed. She wouldn't even notice it was gone until she needed it, and by then, her world would already be falling apart. Mason's next move was to deal with their finances. He headed back to the office and logged into their joint bank account. The numbers on the screen reflected the life they had built together, a life that was now in ruins. He navigated to the transfer section, entering the details for his private account. He had set this account up years ago for emergencies, and tonight, it would serve its purpose perfectly. He initiated the transfer, watching as the balance in their joint account plummeted. Emily would eventually notice, but by then, there wouldn't be a thing she could do. Mason wasn't just taking her money, he was taking her safety net, her future. Once the transfer was complete, Mason logged out and closed the laptop. The quiet of the room felt different now, more like the stillness before a storm. He stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. The simple act helped him refocus, a reminder that there was no going back. As he sipped, he reflected on what he had just done. This wasn't simply about revenge, it was about teaching her a lesson, making sure she understood that her choices came with consequences. She had torn their life apart, and now she would pay the price. But he wasn't done yet. He had to make sure there was no way for her to recover from this. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a lawyer he knew from work. They weren't close, but Mason knew the man owed him a favor. And tonight, he intended to call it in, fast-tracking the divorce and taking everything he could legally get. The phone rang a few times before the groggy voice of the lawyer answered. "Hello. It's Mason. I need your help," Mason said, his voice calm and firm. "Mason? What's going on?" "I'm filing for divorce. I want it done quickly. Can you make that happen?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a cautious response. "Yeah, I can handle that. But are you sure? What happened?" Mason didn't hesitate. "Just get the paperwork started. I'll send the details in the morning." "All right," the lawyer said. "I'll get on it." Mason hung up the phone, his thoughts racing ahead to the next steps. Emily had started this, but he was going to end it. She had taken their life and twisted it into something ugly and unrecognizable. Now, piece by piece, he would strip it all away from her, leaving nothing for her to cling to. He walked back to the bedroom, standing in the doorway, his eyes on the suitcase shoved under the bed and the half-empty jewelry box on the vanity. This was only the beginning. 2 days passed. The living room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the computer screen sitting on the coffee table. Mason sat in a chair, facing the door, his heart pounding steadily in his chest, but his mind was eerily calm. He had been waiting for hours, replaying the events in his mind over and over again, becoming more resolute with each passing thought. Finally, the sound he had been waiting for arrived, a car pulling into the driveway. He didn't move, just listened as the engine cut off, followed by the familiar sound of Emily's heels clicking against the pavement. The front door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her expression a mix of exhaustion and annoyance. But that quickly changed as her eyes took in the scene before her. "What the?" Emily's voice faded as she stared at the scattered documents, the open laptop, and Mason's cold, unwavering gaze. Her confusion quickly gave way to unease. "Mason?" she asked cautiously, her voice tight with uncertainty. "What's going on?" Mason didn't answer right away. He let the silence hang between them, watching as her unease deepened into fear. Slowly, he stood, his movements measured and controlled, stepping closer to her. "Welcome home, Emily," he said, his voice calm but icy. I hope you enjoyed your trip. Emily's eyes darted from the laptop to the papers strewn across the table. Her face paled as she recognized what they were: emails, chat logs, screenshots. What is this? She asked, her voice now shaking. Mason took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. This, Emily, is proof. Proof of your lies. Proof of your betrayal. Proof of your greed. Emily's eyes widened, and she stumbled back a step, her hands trembling. You went through my things. Her voice was a mix of anger and shock, but Mason could hear the fear seeping through. Every last bit of it, Mason replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I've read the emails, the messages, seen the photos. I know everything. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and her eyes darted around the room as though she was searching for a way out. Mason, wait, I can explain. Explain what? Mason interrupted, his voice rising. Explain how you've been sleeping with your boss. How you've been planning this affair behind my back for months. Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. The color drained from her face as she realized the full extent of what Mason had discovered. This isn't what you think, she stammered, grasping for some kind of excuse. Isn't it? Mason stepped forward again until he was just inches from her. I've made sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done. I sent copies of those emails and messages to your boss's wife, to HR, to your friends, and your family. They all know, Emily. They know everything. Emily's face twisted in horror as the weight of his words sank in. You can't do that, she whispered, her voice trembling. You can't destroy my life like this. Mason's expression hardened, his eyes cold. I already have. And it's far from over. Emily's eyes welled up with tears as she reached out to him, her voice desperate. Mason, please, we can fix this. We can work through it. Don't do this to me. Don't ruin everything. Mason glanced at her hand, hanging there in the air between them, and for just a second, he felt a pang of the old pain, the old love. But it was snuffed out by the memory of her betrayal. He took a step back, out of her reach. Everything's already destroyed, Emily. You shattered it the moment you chose to cheat on me, to lie to me, he said, gesturing to the documents on the table. These are just the remains of what we had. Emily's tears spilled over, and she collapsed to her knees, clutching at his pant legs. Please, Mason, don't do this. I made a mistake, I know, but we can start over. We can rebuild. I love you, I never stopped loving you. Mason looked down at her, his heart as cold as ice. You didn't love me, Emily. You loved the life I gave you, the stability, the comfort. But when that wasn't enough for you, you went looking for more. You betrayed me, and now you'll pay for it. Emily sobbed, her body trembling with the force of her crying. Please, Mason, I'm begging you, don't throw everything away. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job, cut off all contact with him, just please, don't leave me. Mason's face remained expressionless. It's too late, Emily. I've already filed for divorce. The papers will be here in the morning. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, you can't. I can, and I have, Mason said firmly. You'll be served tomorrow. And now, you need to pack your things and leave my house. I've already moved the money and assets. You'll get what's left, but it won't be much. Emily's face crumpled as she let out a wail, collapsing fully onto the floor. Mason, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Without a glance back, Mason turned away from her, his resolve unwavering. He paused for a moment, listening to her cries, the sound of her world falling apart. But he didn't turn around. Goodbye, Emily, he said, his voice cold and final. And with that, he walked out of the house. Mason sat back in the living room, the glow of his phone illuminating his face. The screen was filled with unread messages and missed calls, most from people he hadn't spoken to in years. News had spread fast within their circle, especially with a scandal like this. He scrolled through the messages, seeing the shocked and confused reactions to the chaos he had unleashed. But none of it mattered to him anymore. Emily's life was falling apart, just as he had planned. The first move in his plan had been to reach out to her boss, Greg. Mason had waited until the next morning, giving Emily just enough time to start feeling the weight of what was happening. Then he sent the emails, the chat logs, the photos, all of it, to Greg's work email with a simple, direct message: "You destroyed my marriage, now watch yours go up in flames." Mason knew the fallout would be swift and brutal. Greg was married with children, his entire career built on the image of professionalism and integrity. The scandal would obliterate that image in an instant. And it didn't take long. By noon, Mason's phone buzzed with a news alert: a local business scandal involving a well-known executive. He didn't need to read the details to know exactly what it was. He could picture the chaos at Greg's office, the frantic calls from HR, the emergency meeting with the board, the PR disaster that followed. Greg was suspended, pending an investigation, but Mason knew it wouldn't end there. The evidence was damning, and the company wouldn't take the risk of keeping him on. Within days, Greg was ousted from his position. The once respected executive was now a disgraced man, his reputation in ruins. For Emily, the fallout was even more devastating. The first sign of her downward spiral arrived in the form of a cold, impersonal email from HR, informing her that she was being placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. Her once esteemed position in the company had become a source of humiliation. The very people she had tried to impress through her affair now saw her as nothing more than a liability, a scandal waiting to tarnish the company's reputation. Mason knew she was at home when the email landed. He could picture her sitting at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she read the words that confirmed her worst fears. The life she had constructed out of lies and betrayal was crumbling around her, and she was powerless to stop it. Her attempts to reach Greg went unanswered. Desperate, she reached out to her friends, but they were either too busy or too uncomfortable to respond. They knew about the affair now, everyone did. The whispers, the judgmental stares, the quiet conversations behind her back, it was all centered around her. Mason could imagine the panic in her voice as she called their mutual friends, hoping to find someone who would listen, only to be met with cold indifference. Emily was no longer the charming, driven woman they had once respected. She had become a scandal, a cautionary tale. As the days dragged on, Emily's world closed in on her, becoming smaller and more suffocating. Her once bright career was in tatters. The promotion she had sacrificed everything for was now nothing more than a distant fantasy, replaced by the harsh reality of unemployment and public disgrace. She was utterly alone in a way she had never been before. One evening, Mason's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering, knowing it could only bring bad news. The voice on the other end was cold and professional. "Mr. Carter, this is Rachel from the HR department at Emily's company. We're calling to inform you that Emily has been terminated, effective immediately. Due to the circumstances surrounding her departure, her severance package will be withheld." Mason didn't flinch. "Thank you for letting me know," he replied, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. The call ended, and Mason leaned back, staring at the phone in his hand. It was over. Emily had lost everything, her job, her standing, her future. The satisfaction he had once felt began to fade, replaced by a hollow emptiness. The balance had been restored, but at what cost? The final piece of the fallout came in the form of a call from Emily herself. It was the first time she had reached out since the night she returned from her trip. Mason considered letting it go to voicemail, but ultimately decided to hear her out. "Mason," her voice was small, fragile, almost broken. I just got fired. They said I violated company policy. I've lost everything, Mason, everything. He stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. He could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, on the other end of the line. Please, Mason, she continued, her voice shaking. I know I hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I never thought it would go this far. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. Now I've lost everything, and I don't know what to do. I need you. Mason felt a flicker of something, maybe pity, maybe regret, but it was quickly buried beneath the lingering anger deep inside him. Emily, he said, his voice cool and detached, you made your choices. You chose to betray me, to lie to me, and to tear apart our marriage for your own selfish desires. Now you're dealing with the consequences. I warned you there would be consequences. But I never thought, she sobbed. I never thought you'd go this far. I never imagined you'd destroy my life like this. Mason closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. You destroyed your own life, Emily. I just made sure you couldn't run away from the consequences. The line went quiet, and for a moment, Mason thought she had hung up. But then he heard her voice again, soft and broken. I'm sorry, Mason. I'm so sorry. If I could take it all back, I would. Mason didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He ended the call and placed the phone down, his hands trembling slightly. The fallout was complete. Emily's life was in ruins, and he had orchestrated every single part of it. But as he sat there, alone in the dim light, an unsettling emptiness crept in. In destroying her, it felt like he had also destroyed something within himself. The grim satisfaction he had anticipated was gone, leaving nothing but a hollow void. The revenge he had planned so carefully had come to fruition, but the cost was far greater than he had ever expected. Mason remained at the kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in around him. The sun had long since set, and the only light came from a small lamp on the counter, casting long shadows across the room. The house, once filled with the warmth of shared moments and laughter, now felt like an empty shell, a stark reminder of the life he had dismantled piece by piece. His eyes drifted to the empty chair across from him, the chair where Emily used to sit during their dinners. He could still hear the echoes of their conversations, the way they would talk about their days, their dreams, their plans for the future. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, like they were part of a different life, lived by a different Mason. His phone buzzed on the table, but Mason didn't bother to check it. He had been flooded with messages ever since the scandal had broken, most from people wanting to gloat over Emily's downfall or express their disbelief at how far things had gone. He didn't care about any of it. The revenge that had once driven him now felt like a weight, one he wasn't sure he could carry much longer. Mason stood up and wandered into the living room, where the remnants of his plans still lay scattered across the coffee table. The laptop sat open, displaying the emails and messages that had sealed Emily's fate. He stared at the screen, the words blurring together as his mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. He had wanted her to pay, and she had. Emily had nothing left, no job, no friends, no future. He had made sure of that. But in the process, he realized, he had also lost something. The anger that had fueled him had burned out, leaving behind an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. Mason closed the laptop and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts drifted to the man he had become, the lengths he had gone to in order to destroy Emily's life. At the time, it had felt justified, even righteous. But now, the victory felt bitter and meaningless. The doorbell rang, jolting Mason out of his thoughts. He hesitated for a moment before getting up to answer it. When he opened the door, he was taken aback to see Emily standing there. Her face was pale and drawn, and it looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a deep sadness that cut through him. "Mason," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I didn't know where else to go. He stood there, speechless, staring at her. The last time they had spoken, she had been on her knees, begging for his forgiveness. Now, she stood before him, a shell of the woman she once was. "What do you want, Emily?" Mason's voice was weary, drained of the anger that had once fueled him. I just wanted to talk," she said softly, her eyes pleading with him. "Please, Mason, just let me explain." Mason sighed heavily, then stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She walked into the living room, glancing around as if she were seeing the house for the very first time. The silence between them was thick, filled with all the words that had gone unspoken over the past few weeks. They sat down across from each other, the tension between them almost tangible. Emily clasped her hands together, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. "I know you hate me," she began, her voice trembling, "and I don't blame you. I've lost everything because of what I did, and I deserve that. But I need you to understand, I never meant to hurt you like this." Mason looked at her, his expression blank, unreadable. "But you did, Emily. You hurt me in ways I didn't think were possible." "I know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "And I can never undo that. But I need you to believe me when I say I never planned for any of this to happen. I got caught up in something, and it spun out of control. I was stupid, selfish. I thought I could have it all, my career, my affair, and still keep you." Mason clenched his fists, the anger he thought he had buried bubbling up again. But it wasn't the searing rage that had driven him before, it was a deep, aching sorrow. "You can't have everything, Emily. You made a choice, you chose him over us." Emily wiped at her tears, nodding. "I know. And I lost. I lost everything because I couldn't see what I was throwing away. I don't expect you to forgive me, Mason, but I need you to know that I am truly sorry." Mason looked away, his eyes focusing on a spot on the floor. He had spent countless hours imagining this moment, thinking about what he would say if she ever came back. But now that she was sitting in front of him, all those rehearsed words seemed empty. "I've already forgiven you, Emily," Mason said quietly, "but that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change what we lost." Emily's shoulders sagged, the weight of his words seeming to crush her. "So, what happens now?" she asked in a small voice. Mason was silent for a long time, searching for an answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I don't know, Emily. I really don't know." The silence between them grew, the reality of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Mason knew deep down that things would never be the same between them. The love they had shared was gone, replaced by a cold, hard truth neither of them could ignore. "I think it's time for us both to move on," Mason said finally, his voice steady but firm. "You need to figure out what you're going to do next, and I need to figure out who I am, without you." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I just hope. I hope that one day, you'll find peace." Mason stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "I hope you do too, Emily. I really do." She looked at him one last time before turning to leave, her footsteps echoing through the quiet house. As the door clicked shut behind her, Mason felt a strange sense of finality. The chapter of his life defined by betrayal and revenge had finally come to a close. But as he stood there in the stillness, he realized that his journey wasn't over yet. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear, he couldn't stay trapped in the past. He had to rebuild, to move forward from the wreckage of the life he once knew. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mason felt a faint flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a dim light in the darkness, guiding him toward whatever came next.